In the late 19th century, there was a policy created in China that affected many people and families. The one-child policy was a crucial point in history among the Chinese. In an effort to control the population, China enforced the one-child policy by limiting families to one child. Because the Chinese prioritize male over females, some families will accept the harsh penalties the Chinese government enforces for having more than one child.
China's population is 4 times the U.S. population. They have 32 cities with each a population of over a million. 400 million Chinese live in the cities, while 900 million live in the rural areas. In some rural areas, Chinese families can have more than one child.
China is located in Eastern Asia and is 3,748,000 square feet. It is known to be the most populous country in the world. 1 in every 5 people live in China. Their population is 1.3 billion people, that's 20% of the whole world. It started to rapidly grow. In 1980, China reached its 1 billion mark, so something had to be done to maintain their population. In 1979, the one-child policy was introduced as a way to slow China's fertility rate and concern for overpopulation.
700 years ago, a Chinese birth chart was found and was used for about 300 years after. These charts were made in ancient China to help predict whether the child would be male or female. When birth charts were set up, there was a 50% chance of being a male or female, but the people who still use it say the chance is 93% accurate.
In 1955, officials made a campaign to launch birth control, but it backfired in 1958 only to have more children being born.
As the policy was first introduced, the Chinese government thought it would be better to have more graves than one child.
Many Chinese families didn't register the births of their children. Those children are called black children. There are over 1 million black children in China. Those children don't get health insurance or educational benefits. The bad part of having black children is that black children are only girls, so those girls may feel bad about themselves or their parents don't care about them.
The policy has raised the number of children in orphanages, especially girls. This makes U.S. couples want to adopt in China. In 2006, 6,493 children were adopted from China.
In China, the 1911 Chinese Revolution occurred because husbands would force their wives into prostitution, fathers would force their daughters into marriages that women didn't want to be in, and husbands could even sell their daughters into slavery for money. The 1911 Revolution was the beginning of change for China. The government finally took a stand.
Every second, 34 babies were born in China alone. Every year, the population was growing by 7 million.
In the 1950s, China had realized something had to change because of the population, and that is why they created birth control. During that time, the government made its first turn in supporting abortions.
China promoted the use of birth control since the making of the People's Republic in 1949.
Xinhua, a Chinese reporter, said, "The report said the population is heading for negative growth and an ultra-low fertility rate, as well as faces issues related to aging, gender imbalances, urbanization, and expanding shortage of migrant workers in an only-child generation." The report that Xinhua had read was from an article that he had seen, but had different thoughts about the policy.
In 1970, a woman had about 6 children. Now they have 1 to 2 because of the one-child policy.
Due to the policy, a young woman was forced a chemical abortion after 7 months of her pregnancy. The young woman and her husband were fined $6,400 for their unauthorized second pregnancy. To control China's population in the 1980s to 1990s, China made a law that led to abandonment and murder of children who weren't the first child of a family.
In 1979, China had created the one-child, one-couple policy that was quickly changed to the one-child policy.
In 1982, the family planning was made a state policy, and families were able to have a second child in some places if their first child was a female and they had the second child at least 5 years after their first.
The birth of a son is a celebration to them, and the birth of a daughter is a small happiness. The reason is because the son carries on the family line. When a daughter is married, she leaves her family to go to her husband's family.
The males were the most favored by the Chinese government, especially the firstborn. They usually took in the family name and took care of the elderly parents.
Who supported the policy reduced the population of China by 250 million.
The government believes the policy is effective because families can concentrate on their one kid and women can focus on getting jobs.
Deng Xiaoping, a civilian in China, thought it was the only way to improve living standards and make reforms work was to lower the population.
The fine for having an extra child is around $200,000.
The one-child policy was created to make China's population decrease, but they hadn't thought through the consequences of this policy.
Shortly after the policy was created, families had started to prioritize males over females. By 2020, the government states they'll be short 30 million brides.
Because the gender ratio is 131 men for every 100 women, and in some places 179 men for every 100 women, and families prioritize males, the government has made it illegal to tell the gender of the child during an ultrasound. The families have to find out the sex once the child is born.
The intention the government had for this policy was not to have a difference in gender ratios.
Due to the policy, there were many children that were not officially registered at birth.
If a family had a female but didn't want to keep that child, they would oftentimes drive out to the countryside and abandon the girls. Those girls are considered missing girls in the Chinese government.
It is forbidden to discriminate against, mistreat, or abandon baby girls, said from an unknown author.
Policy has affected over 300 million births. Most couples want to try to pay for their second child if they have the money.
Lu Zufang said, "If I have one child, it will be raised better. It will have more opportunities, and my career is the most important thing. I really want to excel at it." Meaning, more than one child can be a handful. Also, saying to focus more on yourself more than other people, because having more than one child can be a handful.
For most women on a second pregnancy, they either have to pay a fine or have an abortion. If they can't pay the fine, they typically blindfold her and force her to sign a consent. The consent is being able to have a legal injection in the woman's stomach.
When a family can't pay a fine for their second or third child, husbands are in prison until wives commit to child-killing procedures.
Some more consequences that happen if a couple can't pay for a fine is the couple's land is taken away, their house is destroyed, they lose their jobs, or the child is not allowed to attend school.
People who supported the policy reduced the population of China by 250 million.
Any child in a family is likely to become a solitary and socially inept adult.
The one-child policy has affected many people throughout China. Women have been affected miraculously. In China alone, 500 people commit suicide a day, and suicide is the #1 cause of death in China among women between the ages of 15 and 23 because they have gotten pregnant but don't want to suffer the consequences of the policy. 56% of the world's suicides are in China.
A huge controversial topic in China is forced abortions. On average, there are 35,000 abortions a day and 13 million abortions a year. Some types of abortions are the person will inject a needle into the uterus to kill the fetus, and if that doesn't work, they deliver the child and drown the child.
In rural areas, women's vaginas are checked on a regular basis to make sure that they have no recent pregnancies, because the woman and man who want to have a child must have a birth permit to have a child.
Because of the everyday payments and the government payment, we prefer not to have 2 children, said Ms. Ding on January 2, 2011. Families have to pay at least 10,000 yuan for a child on a regular basis. 1 yuan is $0.16 US.
In recent years, the Chinese government has tried to reward families who have only one child instead of penalizing families who have more. This is more successful for cities rather than farming families.
Parents who have only one child get a one-child glory certificate, which lets them have economic benefits like extra month's salary every year until the child is 14.
By 2040, the ratio of children is supposed to drop 2 to 1.